Innovative practices being put into place around Australia, health tech, fintech, and indeed construction tech. All these spaces are booming. Proposed changes to user content copyright laws could indeed save Aussie startups from being taken to court. Let's break down some of these news stories. Alex McCauley, CEO of Startup Australia, joining the program live from our Sydney CBD studio, and a warm welcome to you. Let's kick off with these changes on copyright laws, just sort of a scene setter on the broader innovative commons, really. Where to, and what have been the constraints thus far?
Sure. So, I mean, this is something that Australian businesses have been crying out for quite some time. I mean, Australia's copyright laws are about 20 years behind the rest of the world when it comes to digital content and online content marketplaces. At the moment in Australia, companies are directly liable for content uploaded by users if they're a digital platform. So that means a YouTube or a Facebook is liable for content uploaded by its users if it's hosted in Australia. And there are Australian businesses like Redbubble, based down in Melbourne, that are currently being sued by organisations like the Hells Angels for copyright infringement by their users. And so the proposed changes that are currently being deliberated are basically to introduce a safe harbour for these sorts of businesses, so that there's a regime where if copyright holders notice that their copyright material is posted on these websites, they can just contact the websites and ask them to take it down, and the websites are legally required to do so, which is much better than dragging these things through the courts.
You've flagged that this is a Productivity Commission recommendation to essentially make this safe harbour come into play to fix these discrepancies, but how do you fast-track reform here? Where in the pipeline does this kind of a policy change actually sit realistically?
Yeah, I mean, we think this will happen by the end of the year. We're hopeful it will. There's already been draft legislation in the Parliament earlier this year. This Productivity Commission report came out at the end of last year and was responded to favourably by the government in the last week. This is the last of a series of reports by the Productivity Commission and others recommending this sort of reform on copyright. And so we're really hopeful that this legislation will come back into the Parliament this year at the end of the consultation process, and that we'll actually have these changes through by the end of the year.
Let's talk another innovative kind of pressing reform issue, and that is the idea of company directors or anyone who's aspiring to that role, the notion of insolvency and the kind of black mark that does carry currently. How might that be massaged somewhat to make the kind of the bane not as sort of severe and long lasting?
Yeah, so this is another area where Australia is a bit of an outlier. We've got some of the strictest insolvency laws of any country in the world. And what that means for startups is they're already considered to be risky propositions by people who are customers or employees. And for directors, that risk is compounded by the fact that we've also got some of the strictest insolvency laws in the world. So what we want is for Australia's best business talent to be able to be involved with Australia's best emerging companies right from the outset, and to be providing mentorship and guidance from the boardroom. At the moment, that's just not happening because it's just too risky for potential directors of these companies to sit on these boards. So what the proposed changes do is to bring in, again, another safe harbour-like mechanism for directors to sit on these boards, and when a company looks like it's insolvent, they can actually then, under these new changes, keep trading as long as they're reasonably confident, based on evidence, that the company is going to return in the near future to solvency. So there's just a little bit of a common sense tweak there that's going to really make a big difference for young companies.
That said, I mean, one person's evidence is another person's hypothesis unproven. You know, that's a pretty subjective call to put in the hands of individuals who've got one eye on their next move as well, and if they're called out for being way of the mark because of pressure internally, how does that square?
Yeah, I mean, this is still a long way short of the kind of regime that they have in the US, for example, around these sorts of measures. And I should say it's much broader than just startups. It goes right across the corporate landscape for directors of all companies. There are still some very clear guidelines in the proposed legislation around the kinds of evidence that you can look for in terms of a path to solvency, and there's some pretty clear tests in there. So, I mean, the courts will still be involved in this process, but this just adds a little bit more flexibility and reduces the risk slightly for directors getting involved in young, early-stage companies.
Then again, you've said this is tied inevitably to the success of these startups, and yet the notion of senior mentors and kind of the advisory position versus the formality of being on the board. One thinks even of David Murray wading into a fintech proposition, obviously carrying all of that institutional memory and experience with him, but not actually formally tied by dint of a directorship. So is that not a template on things to come?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that startups are doing right now, and it's certainly effective, but startups also need to access corporate governance talent in order to help them steer the way through the hardest part of building a business, which is right at the start. It's when you're building a global business, you need really experienced people in the boardroom to help you do it. So mentors and advisors can only go so far, I think.
It's really interesting, is it not, though, if you take a step back and ponder, the reason that a lot of these companies don't last the course being inevitably one of, this is not a product or service that the market has a desire to run with. Where are we at with the kind of that Shark Tank mentality right from the outset, kind of the brutal, you've got to be bad to be sort of kind, in other words, to paraphrase.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that feeds into this sense that some of these changes are trying to address, which is that failure is inherently bad, and that you're not going to get another job if you run a company and it falls over. I think that sense has really got to shift, and some of these changes are aimed at doing that. In places where startups have really added value to the economy, failure is seen as a positive. It's a learning experience, and as you say, you've got to try and find that product market fit, and the only way you can do that is by experimentation.
Let's just finish on one kind of tangible to all of that, and that is the Hyper Anna funding story. Now, this is coming out of Sydney and closing out a funding round. It's a VC involvement here, so just speak to that briefly if you could.
Yeah, this is a really exciting development, Carson. It's one of Sydney's sort of most exciting startups. It's an artificial intelligence analytics company, mostly in the fintech space, so selling to banks and other big finance companies. Basically, it's the Siri for analytics. So you can sort of ask your computer in plain language to give you some insights from a big data set, and get some visual and very clear analytics back from the artificial intelligence that will learn over time. These guys started last year. They've now raised more than $17 million, the latest round of which was just last week. And it was led by probably the world's leading venture capital firm, Sequoia Capital, which is a Silicon Valley-based VC firm, and also backed by Australia's biggest VC firm, Airtree Capital. So watch this space.
Yeah, Siri 2.0, and some by the sounds of it. Thank you so much, Alex McCauley, CEO of Startup Australia there, live with the very latest on kind of what's hot and what might still need to move on the legislative front to unlock further potential in that sector. We'll take a break. When we come back, going global and geopolitical fears balancing now against strength on the eco data front, bond markets